The recent free trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine's met with much support as the country continues its fight for territorial sovereignty and political integrity. The deal, which still needs parliamentary approval, would eliminate 99.9% of tariffs on current imports from Ukraine into Canada and 86% of Ukrainian tariffs on a variety of Canadian products, including industrial goods and agriculture. Beyond the obvious economic value this would bring, to what extent will the deal help Ukraine move away from Russia's influence? For that, we turn to Justin Ling, a reporter with Vice magazine. Justin, it's great to see you.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Your recent piece published yesterday said the deal could, quote, facilitate energy exports to Ukraine and could pave the way for a separate agreement that allows Canadian companies to export restricted weapons to the embattled country. Let's start there. How so?
Well, so this trade deal in and of itself at the moment is mostly symbolic. If we're talking about actual economic gains, it's pretty minor. I mean, the Ukrainian economy is only expected to benefit to the tune of about $15 million a year thanks to this deal. The Canadian economy will only see about $23 million of economic benefit. So all in all, the deal doesn't actually mean all that much in the short term. But Ottawa is currently looking towards other ways in which this relationship can be strengthened. So when Canada signed the free trade agreement with a Western or developed nation, usually it looks to liberalize other facets of the Canadian trade economy. So one of those examples would be basically relaxing trade restrictions on automatic weapons, and that's exactly what we're doing right now in Ukraine. The government has looked into adding Ukraine to a list of automatic firearms control countries, and that basically means that Canadian arms manufacturers will be able to sell to the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian army without too much loopholes or restrictions. So that's probably good news for the Ukrainian army, which is facing a serious shortage in weaponry, especially heavy weaponry, and is currently seeing themselves outgunned by the Russian.
But the reason Canada wasn't selling weapons to Ukraine previously, before this free trade agreement, I mean, I'll say great, that's great, but the reason they weren't doing it before wasn't because of a lack of a free trade agreement. I mean, I think their hands were tied in part because the problem lies in Washington, no?
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think Canada has had a policy over the last several years of refusing, at least in their mind, refusing to exacerbate potentially dangerous conflicts. So when the question came to Ottawa whether or not they were going to arm Syrian rebels fighting the Assad government, Canada backed off and said, the Americans can do that, the Saudis can do that. We don't think it's wise to be throwing weapons into a crisis that could lead to those weapons being put in the wrong hands, or that could lead to more innocent deaths. And I think that has been the logic thus far in Ukraine. The philosophy has been, do we want to send weapons over to the Ukrainian army, knowing that paramilitary groups, fascist groups like the right sector have been somewhat integrated in the Ukrainian army? Do we want to do it knowing that it could only seek to lead to more violence between the Russians? Do we want to send over those weapons knowing that could actually impedite a peace agreement with Moscow? And I think eventually, as the conversation went on, Ottawa realized that maybe it actually does make sense. And the Ukrainian army is perfectly responsible, especially since they've started getting proper training from the Canadian and American military. So right. I think it was honestly just a maturation of the conflict and a realization that it actually could do a lot of good for the Ukrainian army to have similar weaponry to the enemies they're facing.
Though, of course, the risk would be Putin saying, hey, Canada, your weapons are killing my people in the region. So I still think that is something that sort of factors into their decision. But what kind of stuff is it that Ukraine needs that we have to provide? I mean, they would probably need anti-tank rockets, perhaps, maybe some shoulder launch missiles to shoot down planes. Do we have that kind of stuff to be able to provide them?
So here's the thing. Canada was always able to send over its own weaponry. The Canadian government is obviously not bound by this list that it itself manages. So if the Canadian government had wanted to sell Ukraine or give Ukraine light weaponry, pistols, tanks, well, you name it, it could have done so. Part of the problem is, and we've asked Canada this a couple of times, is that we just don't have the things to send. The weaponry we do have is not interoperable with the Soviet-era weaponry that a lot of the Ukrainians are using, and we just don't have a lot of spare weaponry to begin with. I mean, we are in an era of prudence in the military where there's not a lot of money to go around, and I think a lot of the surplus weaponry has either already been sold or decommissioned altogether. So from the get-go, the Canadian government is not going to have much to do with selling weaponry to the Ukrainians. What it will have a lot to do with is approving export permits. So if a Ukrainian company or the Ukrainian army rather, wants to go to a Canadian company and say, we're looking to buy, shoulder-mounted RPGs or machine guns, mortars, you name it, that would be the process through which they would apply to the Canadian government to actually manage that export, and the Canadian government could approve it. At least at that point, the Ottawa can say, it's not that we sent these weapons or not that we're giving these weapons, it's we merely approved the export deal, much like Russia commonly sells weaponry to all sorts of violent factions around the world, including the Assad government and, in some cases, North Korea. So it's a little bit more of an arm's length process than the Canadian government actually giving up this weaponry.
What about energy exports? Of course, you mentioned that in your piece, energy exports, that would be great to reduce Ukraine's dependence on, say, Gazprom, for instance. We don't have a pipeline. I mean, how would Canada facilitate that?
So we've been asking about this for a while, and going back several months, there was a real concern in Ukraine that they would not even have enough energy to get themselves potentially through this winter.
And Russia recently cut off natural gas.
Exactly, and this of course a couple months back. What we were looking at was rebels leading the charge into Donetsk and Donbass, where the biggest reserves of Ukrainian natural gas currently lie. And while they haven't taken over all of those facilities yet, they managed to capture some areas that basically include natural gas reserves or nearby. And a lot of American companies that were drilling in the area have pulled up shop and left because of the conflict. So while that's a bit of a stasis right now, it's not quite obvious where that's going to go right now. It's fair to say that Ukraine should be worried about the sovereignty of that area. On the flip side, you look at Crimea, where there's a huge amount of offshore underwater natural gas reserves that is currently in the hands of the Russians. And so what you're looking at is basically Ukraine losing much of its natural gas reserves to Russia, and at the same time, Russia, which is a huge exporter of natural gas and energy to Ukraine, has either reversed pipelines in the area, cut off exports altogether, or jacked up prices for Kiev, making it nearly impossible for Kiev to meet its energy needs. So they've tried various ways to get around that. They've tried getting their allies to reverse pipeline flows into Ukraine, which Russia has put a stop to by leveraging its basically energy hegemony on the area. It's made things very hard for Ukraine. So what has Ukraine done? Ukraine started looking to some of its allies to see if it could find new ways to get energy into the country. And the U.S. and Canada have been a big part of that equation. Of course, the problem is that we don't have any way to actually get that oil or natural gas to market. And so you have Ukraine saying, if you can get us Alberta oil or Saskatchewan natural gas, we will buy it from you. And naturally, it's the EU, it would be very interested in weaning itself off of Russian natural gas, and everybody wins in this scenario. We get a good price that is much better than what the Americans are paying us. We get a reliable market full of allies that we can trust, and we're helping our ally protect its own sovereignty. So it would be a good deal for everybody. The problem is, how do you get it there? The Energy East pipeline is currently probably the best way to do that because it brings us oil or natural gas to eastern ports and would allow us to ship directly to, say, the United Kingdom or even Spain.
You could build a pipeline to the coast, there's that. You could encourage them to frack, there's also that. But the problem, in my opinion, in this particular scenario is Ukraine doesn't really have a lot of money right now. In any event, Justin, it was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope we see you again.
Absolutely. Cheers.